Wonderful. Thanks all for joining today's Lunch and Learn discussion. My name's Jeanne Merrill. I'm the Executive Director of the Berkeley Food Institute. I'm pleased to moderate today's discussion with Andy Green, who has served as the Senior Advisor for Fair and Competitive Markets, where he coordinated USDA's competition and market regulatory policy. Before we begin, some housekeeping tips. We will have time after my discussion with Andy to answer your questions. You can add your questions to the Q&A, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. The webinar is being recorded, and we will post the recording to the website. Let me just double check. Okay, good. I see the recording button. Wonderful. Excellent. Well, Andy, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time. Before we begin our conversation, I wanted to provide a little bit of background on fair and competitive markets in U.S. agriculture, focusing on the livestock industry and related corn and soybean industries, as those are the areas where USDA has focused its work on competition issues. We've seen a tremendous concentration in the livestock industry in the U.S. and globally. The value of global meat production has increased from roughly $65 billion in 1961 to more than $300 billion by 2014, an increase of more than 500%. And foundational to conventional animal agriculture in the US and globally is corn and soybean production. From 1990 to 2017, global corn and soybean production more than doubled. In 2016, the U.S. was the highest producer of corn with 384 million metric tons in production, followed by China, Brazil, and the EU. And the U.S. and Brazil lead in global soybean production. The three largest meat industry firms are JBS of Brazil, Tyson Foods Inc. of the U.S., and WH Group Limited of China. In the U.S. market, the three companies control 63% of the pork packing. Just two companies, Tyson and JBS, control 46% of the beef packing, and Tyson controls 38% of the poultry market. I can recommend the book, The Global Meat, through MIT Press, which has more on these issues, and we'll put that link in the chat following today's discussion. Andy, prior to your time with USDA, you were the Managing Director of Economic Policy and then Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, managing an economic policy team that covered macroeconomic policy, budget, tax issues, trade, financial markets, labor, infrastructure, and more. And you obviously came to USDA with an extensive background in financial regulation, trade policy, antitrust, work on issues of middle-class economics. What drew you to work on fair and competitive market issues in agriculture?
Thanks so much, Jeanne. Can you hear me okay?
Just fine, yeah.
Great, thank you. It's really great to be here, and apologize for the kind of snowy technology hiccups in the beginning. So I came to work in Washington in the middle of the last financial crisis, two financial crises ago, 2008, 2009 financial crisis, when the largest financial firms in the country cratered the economy, left millions of people without jobs, left millions of people without homes, and an economy that really was a slap in the face to working families, when the largest folks, the most powerful financial interests got their bonuses and working families got left on the wayside. And I worked through that with Senator Berkeley from Oregon as a wonderful, wonderful boss on the banking committee. And we worked to right-size what is the financial system, worked to restore people's opportunities for jobs, for housing, for fair treatment from their credit cards. And I did that for a number of years, and eventually was over at the Center for American Progress. Towards the end of the Obama administration, it was also becoming clear that the recovery had not been felt strongly enough across the country. And in particular, that there was too much concentration of economic power still, and that families, working families in the heartland, were still suffering. And one of the challenges that was coming to the fore was concentration and insufficient competition. And so at the Center for American Progress, we began to tackle that work. And I was drawn, again, from that background of having worked on the financial crisis and the financial crisis response to how do we solve this challenge of the economy working for a small number of people in rural America, in heartland America, but not working for everyone. And so I dove into that challenge, got to know some of these issues. And in 2020, when the Biden election occurred, I thought I was going to be working in financial regulation. I was on the transition team doing that. But the VILSAC team called me up and said, would you consider working on these issues with us? And I happily volunteered to do that. Not an ag kid by background. I was just saying before I hopped on this call that I'm originally from San Francisco. Both my parents are Cal grads. Public school, Lowell High School in San Francisco. So a lot of, Bay Area connections, not, connected to heartland America in any particular way, shape, or form, but was able to offer a view as an outsider coming in, looking at the challenges that were faced in those places, in those markets, and again, trying to bring a spirit of reform and making the economy work for the hardworking families who, play by the rules and just want to be able to keep their family farm, keep their home, keep their opportunity. That's what drew me into that.
Right. Thank you. Well, let's dive in then in terms of the work that happened on these issues in the Biden-Harris administration. One of the first efforts, of course, to address market concentration issues was the executive order that the president issued on promoting competition in the American economy. USDA followed up on that executive order by issuing an action plan for fairer, more competitive, more resilient meat and poultry supply chain markets. That same year, the administration released its framework for food system transformation. Could you describe for us what were the goals of the executive order, and then related to that, what were the goals of the USDA action plan and related framework documents?
Yeah. So the executive order was truly historic, truly landmark in the sense that it brought together the insights, and tremendous credit obviously to President Biden and to that leadership team with Tim Wu spearheading it at the White House. It brought together an insight that the economy and concentration and competition in the economy is not solely the responsibility of the antitrust agencies, Department of Justice, Federal Trade Commission. It's also the responsibility and the opportunity for a wide range of parts of the government, tools that laws and regulations spread out, again, across many, many agencies have together to take the economy more in favor of open, competitive systems that work for workers rather, than the other alternatives that might be presented. And so it directed 72 actions across the federal government, everything from lowering the price of hearing aids to making the purchasing markets that ranchers and those growing chickens and other agricultural commodities would face, to everything in between, surface transportation, federal maritime, shipping. All of those agencies have a role to play in making choices that would step by step deconcentrate the economy, step by step provide lower prices, fairer treatment for working families, better prices for farmers and ranchers, so that a couple more dollars could be in the pockets of those who are growing our food. And that vision of shared competition policy is deeply transformational. And I think you can see that across the wide range of actions, everything from rules that, again, the Federal Maritime Commission has done to open up shipping with fairer bidding, again, to the work we've done at USDA across a wide range of work. And of course, this of course recognizes the anchoring role that DOJ and the Federal Trade Commission play with, revitalized documents like a merger guideline that are updated to address the challenges of the 21st century. It's about doing this all together.
Wonderful, great. Also, another early action within the administration really focused on what USDA could do in this space was a fairly significant investment, $1 billion in meat processing to support the expansion of small and mid-scale meat processing, going back to the issues I spoke of earlier in terms of we've had just tremendous concentration of the livestock industry and really hampering the ability of small-scale livestock producers to be able to have their meat processed and at a fair price. What were the desired outcomes of that investment in meat processing in particular? And then related to that, how would you describe the status of where we are today following those investments?
Yeah, really important questions. We were coming out in 2020 and 2021 of the worst pandemic supply chain shock in really 100 years. And certainly a supply chain shock, a pandemic that had not been experienced with modern, globally connected supply chains, nationally, just-in-time delivery mechanisms, and none of those systems, which have been put in place really over the last 40 years, were designed. They were all designed to maximize what you might call short-term efficiency. That last penny was squeezed, and inefficiency was squeezed out of the system, or so people thought. Except, just like the financial crisis, that penny of inefficiency left a very large tail of risk over on the other side. And that fat tail of risk, you can call it the black swan. These days we think the climate green swan or whatever it is. That tail risk was entirely underappreciated. It blew up in 2008 with the financial crisis, and it came very much to the fore during the pandemic. And so the recognition was that we needed to build a system in agriculture and really across a number of different industrial areas, not just agriculture, that was resilient to shocks, that was competitive and open for opportunity. It was not concentrated in a small number of hands, that was more democratic and sustainable and accessible to rural communities. The secretary likes to talk about rural communities. He's the first secretary, Senator Vilsack, that has talked about keeping families on the farm. It's always been about, hey, how do we have more efficiency? How do we have fewer people growing more food? Well, actually, if you have fewer and fewer people, who's going to be in the schools? How do we have schools in rural America? If we have fewer and fewer people, how do we have the members of the armed services, which overwhelmingly draw from rural America as a proportion of the population? That there's an endpoint of efficiency, at least short-term efficiency. We have to think about these things on a long-term, sustainable basis. And the key sectors, the processing sectors, really were part of some of these key choke points throughout the economy. We remember from 2020 when shelves were barren and folks couldn't get meat or couldn't get it affordably, when the masks were not available because the supply chains didn't work, or first responders didn't have the right clothes or equipment. Even risks that are probably still present around antibiotics or other things. Those were all very, very salient and important. And so we were fortunate that in the American Rescue Plan, one of the first legislative agenda items of the Biden administration, directed USDA to invest $4 billion to improve supply chain resiliency. And it directed other parts of the federal government to do other things, investing in processing chips, investing in antibiotic resiliency, critical minerals, etc. But it granted us the authority and the mandate to do that on supply chains in agriculture and food. And we identified those critical nodes, one of them being meat and poultry processing, where the over-concentration in extremely high efficiency short-term plants left us vulnerable long-term to the types of shocks that were experienced in 2020, and that contributed to the competition challenges, the concentration challenges that farmers or ranchers faced. And so we took $1 billion of that dollars, invested it in expanding new and enhanced meat poultry processing. We did that through a range of different touch points to the industry. We didn't sort of take $1 billion and plunk it in one spot. We expanded some of the medium-sized facilities that could compete with the largest companies. We expanded the smaller facilities to provide more choices to farmers or ranchers and communities on the ground. There's an amazing set of stories coming out of Oklahoma, for example, where extremely small meat processing facilities revitalized this network of rural communities where farmers or ranchers would drive to small towns in Oklahoma and get their meat for the week and shop in an otherwise hollowed out Main Street. We invested in workforce training, where if you think about many of the workers in meat processing have to have skills of butchering skills and carving skills and obviously slaughter and other skills that they're not taught in the most high schools or even in many community colleges. Those skills are important, and so we invested in skills, we invested in management, we invested in lending capacity so that cooperatives can expand. All those things came together to support a new set of choices for farmers or ranchers that provides a little bit more wiggle room, more competitive opportunities, without shutting down the mainstream system. It's still there. It's just got an expanded set of choices around it and more opportunities for families in rural America to be able to earn another dollar when they sell their products, or get a good paying job for another part of the family, or serve a retail or a revitalized Main Street. One thing I'd also add, those investments in meat and poultry processing, part of a multi-step process, of, again, $4 billion to invest in revitalized food system transformation, we call it, a revitalized food system of more new and better choices. Things like helping farms transition to organic. You all know well that you need a runway to be able to go from a conventional to an organic farm. We help provide that opportunity. Helped invest in rural groceries and other places to fill in food deserts. A whole range of these items that help make the food system more sustainable, more resilient, more competitive.
Great. Another key component of that, of course, is that USDA has fairly unique authority under the Packers and Stockyards Act. You need fair rules also to govern markets, because you can make these investments, of course, are critical, but if you don't change the rules of the game, you might just end up with more concentration, further down the line, as I think you well know. And of course, unique to the Biden-Harris administration, we finally began to see movement forward on a number of those rules. And I wonder if you could just speak to what's been the focus in terms of updating, USDA's updating of the sort of rules and regulations under the Packers and Stockyards Act, and what's the status of those rules currently? Yeah,
thank you, Jeanne. So you hit on it exactly, that this is a multi-pronged effort, that one pillar is the investment, new investments, but another pillar is the market regulation. And Packers and Stockyards, this 100-year-old law that was really in many ways carved off from the Federal Trade Commission in 1921 and dramatically expanded to set the playing field on a level basis. So when farmers, ranchers brought their products, cattle, their hogs, their sheep, whatever it might be, you added chickens or added later, when they were brought to the market, the stockyards at the time, that packers treated them fairly, and that the stockyards, the exchanges of the time, treated farmers or ranchers fairly, and that we had competitive, open, transparent markets. Those, markets have shifted. Stockyards are not really in use anymore. They haven't been in use for 30 to 40 years. The poultry markets are really dramatically different than they were, 100 years ago or 80 years ago. They're all contracted, almost entirely vertically contracted, where the poultry grower more or less serves one company in one complex. And so, it has been, there have been efforts to try to modernize some of these rules in fits and starts for 20 years now. And those fits and starts have, hit a number of obstacles. And unfortunately, there had only been a small number of reforms. We picked up where they left off, but also brought, did some things differently. We decided to do them in bite-sized pieces, piece by piece, in a way that would build momentum, and in a way that would layer on protection. So we started with a rule that provides transparency, a whole disclosure regime. I come from the financial regulatory world, where the Securities and Exchange Act creates tremendously important transparency for investors, for those who want to invest in stocks and bonds. Can't even imagine buying a security without those protections now. We brought that type of disclosure transparency to the contracting that poultry growers enter into with poultry processors. We brought transparency around the differences in inputs, different chicks, different feed, etc., that poultry companies would provide to the grower, so that we're better able to understand what's going on, that the poultry grower can better able to understand what's going on. And once you have an understanding, you can start to track where there are problems, identify them more quickly, and begin to address them. We layered onto that a final rule. This was our second final rule that set some important protections against discrimination on the basis of race, sex, sexual, you name it, the usual full list of religion, etc. protections. We layered on a set of protections against retaliation. There have been many, many reports for years that when poultry farmers would complain to the government, would try to form an association, would try to seek competitive business opportunities with a different processor, that they'd get the worst chicks, or that they would otherwise get, their feed would be late, whatever it might be. We set rules against that type of retaliation, and also enhanced rules against deception. And then we just actually announced it on Tuesday. We published in the Federal Register today a new rule that sets additional fairness protections for poultry growers, so that when they're competing in what's called a tournament system, where they're compared against other growers to try to assess who was the most efficient, who was the best performer, who was the hardest worker, that those comparisons are fair, that the rates that are provided are clear and transparent. And if it's a bonus, not a deduction for something that you didn't do, that it's not excessively variable, and that all growers get some additional insights into the circumstances where they might be asked to put some additional capital on the line to invest in new houses. So those rules were just finalized. We put out a number of other reports and some additional proposed rules that we didn't have time to finalize. Maybe they will continue on in some other form in the new administration. Maybe they'll be paused. And I'm happy to talk about some of that other work we did, but I'm very proud of those three key anchor reforms, two of which are focused on broiler chicken growing, which was a centerpiece of the problem, but the third of which, retaliation protection, discrimination protection, apply across the livestock and poultry industry.
Great, wonderful. Let's come back to that. I wanted to just touch base very briefly on, you also did some work around the seed industry. We've also seen, considerable consolidation within the seed industry with a couple of very large players like Corteva and Bayer, for example, really dominating the corn and soybean markets. Could you talk a little bit more about what you all did vis-a-vis the seed industry as it relates to fair and competitive markets?
Yeah, thank you. So livestock and poultry, as I mentioned, was a big part of our focus because of our authorities in the Packer and the Stockyards Act that have been in place since 1921. We also have been very focused and interested in working on other parts of agriculture that have competition and concentration problems. And seeds is a major part of it. You know, the key seed sectors are heavily concentrated. Corn and soy, the two largest providers make up more than 50% of the market. The top four are above 80 or 90%. When you get into cotton and some of these other areas, it's also still heavily concentrated. And what does that mean? That means higher prices for farmers who have to buy seed. It means less innovation. It means greater dependency on a small and declining number of usable pesticides, herbicides, etc. It means over-reliance on those pesticides and herbicides rather than choices for organic and other sustainable options. It means the use of products, whether it be dicamba or other things that have very serious consequences. And it means less opportunity for plant breeders and scientists and entrepreneurs to build new products and compete in the agricultural economy. All those things, and as well, I'd also point out, there are major national security issues and concerns related to foreign ownership of several of the largest seed companies are foreign owned. So all of that combination of things meant that it's very important for us to look at making sure that the relationship between the intellectual property system, patents, and competition in seeds were properly functioning. Because much like pharmaceuticals, it's the patent, it's the IP that has a big say in whether a product is going to be available, competitive, on the market, access to generics, etc., or not. There really are no generic opportunities, products in pesticides, despite many of the leading products being off patent for a number of years. So we set out to build a partnership with the U.S. Patent and Trade Office and to do some really basic stuff. One of the ways in which the system was getting concentrated was that the patents were in some ways being granted without the type of input that was needed, so that these were really innovations. They were being granted in an overly broad way, and not because of any bad action by our patent examiners, but because we didn't have the full range of information available with these natural systems. So we worked with the Patent Trade Office to get the information out to plant breeders around what are the upcoming pending patents, so that if a plant breeder with expertise and mildew-resistant cucumbers can submit that information to the patent office and have that considered as part of the patent review process. So that was one thing we did with our AMS, Agriculture Marketing Service Seed Liaison. We also worked to enhance the transparency and disclosure tools so that plant breeders and scientists can know where to access seeds deposited in international seed depositories as part of the disclosure requirements of the patent law. And then we've also worked to enhance the transparency that farmers get when they go to buy a bag of seeds under the Federal Seed Act. That law was authored at a time where farmer walked into a store, the label says what the seed variety is. Today, people are buying seeds for advance order online without the information about the kind and the variety. I think there's more work that needs to be done in that area, but making sure that they're competitive, transparent, in the seed sector is really very important and ongoing work to be done.
Yeah, great. I was struck by President Biden's farewell speech where he really warned against the dangers of concentration in the market sort of generally and what that means in terms of impacts across our society. You obviously have been in the sort of the forefront of working on these issues at USDA. Yet a lot of the new rules, which are very important, that have been passed under the Packers and Stockyards Act are really vulnerable to being rolled back in the next administration. I'm curious, Andy, as we look forward, when there is an administration that again wants to dive in and really tackle the challenges and threats of concentrated industries in agriculture. What advice might you offer for that next administration that's willing to take on these issues? What might you have done differently, or what resources might you need to be able to, effectively work on these issues? I'm curious what lessons you've learned in this work.
Yeah, thank you, Jeanne. So I'd say the most important thing that we can all do is to build the network of knowledgeable people, whether they be farmers or ranchers that are seeing whatever challenges they're facing every day and can share those stories, whether it be researchers and students and academics who can think about the law, the economics, the science, the biology, all of these things. The network of journalists and advocacy and farmer advocacy, and frankly, connections to non-agricultural spaces, whether it be able to learn from the successes and still work to be done in the prescription drug universe, learn from the successes and still work to be done in financial reform for how trading markets can work more fairly, how we can better invest and have industrial policies that invest in left behind communities and delivers new jobs and more sustainable new jobs. We invested $900 million into new domestic sustainable fertilizer opportunities. That type of work builds on scientific research that really has to occur at our universities, our land-grant universities, of which Berkeley is a land-grant university. So I think that continued effort to build the connections. Again, I'm not old enough to remember when there were cows in Berkeley at Berkeley Farms, but we can't be siloed off of coastal places that think about fancy tech universes, and then the heartland that is dealing with really tight margins and vulnerable cycles of extreme weather, et cetera. We've got to be one community that's thinking about these problems and working together. So that would be my most important recommendation and plea for all of you as students and academics and researchers to stay engaged, to get engaged, to build that foundation of knowledge and ideas. I am slightly more optimistic about the next 4 years within the space that I work in. I can't tell you how many times I was out in places that I had never been to before, and talking with farmers or ranchers who were saying to me, "Thank you for what you have done." I'm that may disagree with me, or folks that I represent the Biden administration may disagree with us on any number of other things, but on this we're together. I'm hopeful that bottom-up sense of what can we do to create more opportunity for ordinary folks might continue and stay true, and that the force of that shared passion and shared interest will sustain us. We certainly have felt that the work we've done, particularly on the poultry improvements, is stuff that is lasting and meaningful, as well as obviously the work around seeds and improvements to transparency in cattle. I'll give you one more example. We do a lot of work around improving labels. Certainly when you walk into a grocery store, and you want to know what's sustainably raised, what's product of USA, we updated those labels so that product of USA means born, raised, slaughtered, and processed. It's 100% made in USA. If you're going to claim it's a USA label, that is wildly popular across all types of political stripes. And so I'm not going to be overly optimistic, but I think there are opportunities to realign the dynamics that I'm going to seize. I'm going to offer congratulations if those things stick and continue, and critiques if they don't.
Great. Well, thank you, Andy. Let's open it up for questions from our audience, and you can feel free to add your questions in the Q&A. We can also do verbal questions. You would have to raise your virtual hand at the bottom of your screen, and we can call on you if you want to ask a question. But we have one here from Avery that says, was there any actual antitrust action taken under the Packers and Stockyards Act to break up concentrations within agribusiness? And then a comment, it says, it seems that any 11th hour rules put in place will just be removed by the incoming administration. It's expressing concerns about that. But yeah, any antitrust action taken?
Yeah. So we did partner with the Department of Justice a number of ways. We sent to them, and they prosecuted for us 2 landmark cases. Landmark in the sense that they had not done that before. The antitrust division brought Packers and Stockyards cases. One of them was focused on the Wayne Sanderson enforcement action that brought us a consent decree and significant reforms to the 3rd largest poultry processor. And then there was also one against Cook Foods, where that company had tried to block growers from switching integrators with, you might call it, non-compete fees. And so that anti-competitive practice was identified by us and put to was stopped by DOJ's actions. In terms of the last minute rules, it's not so easy to unwind a rule. It's not so easy to do a rule, quite frankly. It takes years to do a rule, and it takes years to undo a rule. So there is actually no legal authority for them to just cancel it. Congress can obviously write a new law anytime they like. There's a law called the Congressional Review Act, which can review regulations as well under expedited procedures. Look, I'm not going to pretend that we can leave things undone and hope that it will be continued without broad-based support. But I think it's not so easy to undo things that are popular as well.
Yeah, great. Another question we have is if you could offer your thoughts on what states' attorney general can do in the antitrust space if the federal government is not willing or able to act.
Great question. We, again, did a really innovative new program where, thanks to some small amount of money, really a tiny amount of money, nearly not even $15 million, created a partnership with over 30 bipartisan state attorneys general, the Agricultural Competition Partnership, where we put again, very small pot of money to be available for the state attorneys general. Again, maybe it's one of them, maybe it's a small group of them. They often work together to bring cases, to try to do research, to do some pilot projects, to enhance competition, focused on food and agriculture, both competition and consumer protection. And that program still exists. And so state attorneys general really, they have the full ability to enforce under the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act. There's no reason they can't act under the Packers and Stockyers Act as well, and also their local laws. And they're going to be very close to what they're seeing and hearing on the ground. But, they need that additional ability to hire, some economists to be able to give expert testimony, or some additional researchers and investigators to look at, sticky problems, whether it be seed competition and concentration fertilizer, challenges in livestock, poultry, grocery. We just saw a huge victory by the state attorneys general in stopping the Albertson-Kroger merger. I have no doubt that there will be attempts to do other mergers in the future, and I do hope state attorneys general will take advantage of the opportunities that they have to have their voices be heard. So I would, encourage students and researchers to, build those partnerships, whether it's be in California or really across the country. With, again, food agriculture is amazingly bipartisan on competition issues, and so take advantage of that.
Yeah, wonderful. We have another question that relates to some recent rules from SIS around salmonella. And the note here says, extremely thankful for the work done to break up the poultry industry and the meat processing industry. Unfortunately, USDA's proposed salmonella rules are written in such a way that they'll only benefit the largest of poultry processors. It seems counterproductive to the achievements accomplished to date. Any thoughts, comments on any of that, Andy?
I don't want to comment specifically on the salmonella rule, but let me just offer some general comments around what I think the thrust of that question is getting at, which is there are tensions that exist between regulatory protections, whether they be in food safety or animal plant health, or other types of regulations, where there are benefits to scale. There's just no way around that. Well, it's not that there's no way around that. It is a reality that there are benefits to scale. But nobody's going to sit here and say, well, we don't care about food safety. If there's a food safety outbreak, that's a disaster for the people that get sick. It's a disaster for the communities where there are facilities that, have that outbreak, and you have to shut them down and clean out those facilities, or maybe even, get rid of them. We just saw that here in Virginia, a real, hundreds of jobs lost. So food safety is important. Animal, plant health, they're important. Other regulatory protections are important. But we also have to invest in making sure that the smaller parties can comply. The smaller processors can do, either meet those standards or meet comparable standards scaled to the nature of the facility. One part of that $1 billion in new meat and poultry processing investment was dedicated to helping smaller facilities meet the food safety needs that are critical for them to be able to sell into a national or even a regional market. And so I think it's just being honest and recognizing that those challenges exist and being creative about how to address them, because they're not going to go away, and pretending they don't exist is just going to create more problems in other ways.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks. I will encourage people to add any questions that they may have in the Q&A at the bottom of their screen. You also have the option to raise your hand, and I can call on you to ask your question verbally. But we have another one here from Mary. You did a lot of travel to farmer meetings during your time. You spoke a little bit about that already. Anything else that you learned from those meetings that sort of stuck with you and helped inform your work at USDA?
That's a great question. I think one of the things that really sticks out to me is that farmers and ranchers have a really, I don't want to say complex, but a kind of a multi-dimensional aspect to the work they're doing. You know, they're touching so many different areas, whether it be the actual physical land and the environment and the stewardship that goes into sustaining the family farm to be able to pass it on to the next generation. They're touching, you know, production and, you know, mechanics, where, you know, they're buying, you know, thousands, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars on tractors and the right to repair those tractors. They're touching complex technology where, you know, the satellite imagery and you know, the technology, the data processing that goes into precision agriculture. They're touching financial markets and their trading markets, where they got to know what's the price of cattle, or what are the futures markets, what's the price of soy going to be in 6 months. There's just and they're touching the local community in their small town. There's so many parts to being a farmer, a rancher, a member of that food and agricultural supply chain market participant, that I really, you know, respect the diversity of knowledge and skill that has to go into that work. It's really incredibly multidimensional, and I think I would encourage, you know, researchers and scholars to do field work and get out in the field and talk to folks and understand what are the real economic challenges, what are the real signals that are being sent by markets or the land, or any number of these things that I've cited, and then to think about how do we make those signals work a little bit better.
We have another question here from Jim, touching on sort of related issues, which is, he says, what are your thoughts on government and industry pressure to force Mexico to accept genetically engineered corn from the United States under the USMCA? And he goes on to say, it strikes me that this will continue to discourage farmers from growing non-GM corn, further concentrating the control of seed/pesticide corporations. That's a tricky one. Any thoughts, Sandy?
Yeah. Again, let me not comment specifically on that matter, but again, let me offer a few general thoughts, which, you know, there's a lot of government policy in agriculture. Sometimes people wish there could be, you know, frankly, a lot of farmers, oh, you know, we don't want government involved. Well, actually, you know, there's government involved in a lot of markets. And the alternatives of not having government involved are almost universally worse. You get booms and busts. You have markets just don't work without rules that set up fair functioning. You couldn't drive down the freeway if you didn't have speed limits, clear signage, and traffic cops on the beat to, you know, stop dangerous folks. And the same is true for markets. Same is true for agriculture. You know, one of the lessons that I think that is true from whether it be USMCA or the Farm Bill or any number of these things is that they need to be updated from time to time. You know, there were important changes that were put in place to make sure that we have a more worker-centric trade policy with rapid response mechanisms where workers were not being given the rights to unionize. That was an important change to included in the USMCA framework that this administration advanced that had not been advanced before and not been developed before. And I think similarly, you know, you see these evolutions in policy. The Farm Bill goes back to, you know, the 1930s and is updated for every 5 years. I think it's not about whether there's government or no government. I think it's about, have we updated these things, Packers and Stockers Act, whatever it might be, have we updated it to reflect our modern needs and our modern values, whether they be sustainability, resiliency, competition, fairness, all of those things, local and regional food systems. And this is really the role of researchers, students, scholars, members of the scholarly community to develop that next set of ideas and put them into the public square for discussion.
Wonderful. I want to get to, we have a couple of people have raised their hands here. Let me call on Michael. And let me see if the technology will allow me to. Can we unmute Michael? There we go. Wonderful. Yeah, Michael, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. Hey, Andy, how are you? Good to see you. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about migrant workers and what progress you made on their rights.
Thank you. Great question. I think we all know that farming depends upon a lot of hard work. Farmers and farm workers. This is an administration that really emphasized workers at every opportunity. We created innovative programs to help empower workers, whether it be to afford basics, supplies. Coming out of the pandemic, a lot of farm workers were not able to afford basic protections for themselves. Whether it be standing up to child labor in some of the processing plants where sometimes migrant workers and the children of them were, doesn't matter where they're from, were working in plants that were illegal, inappropriate, etc. Standing up for union rights and labor power really across the federal government. And so, I know that it is slow work, it is hard work, it is challenging work, but it is work that I know that remains ongoing and needs to be done. And, we cannot have a food system if we don't recognize every part and every little blood, sweat, and tears that every party puts into it to making that happen.
Let me call on next Sarah, who has her hand raised.
Hi. So I would love to ask, there's a lot of talk about decreasing competition in meat and poultry processing, but I'm wondering if you've seen any situations similar in produce. If you have, I would love to hear more about how that's worked.
Yeah. For better or worse, there are limited resources in government. You think that you come in and there's 100,000 people at USDA and wow, we must be able to do everything. And you've got to kind of pick and choose a little bit of where you target. We put a lot of effort into livestock and poultry because it is the largest by dollar volume markets in agriculture, sort of top of the agricultural food chain. But you're absolutely right. There are competition, concentration problems in other aspects as well. And there are authorities. You look at the Perishable Agricultural Commodities Act, which governs specialty crops. There are prohibitions on unfair and deceptive practices, just like there are in the Packers and Stockers Act. So I think really this is one where I'd encourage researchers to help bring to the fore places where more reforms can be done, where we can create more opportunities. There's a couple of things that I'd point out that we did do that I think are really important. One is we invested a lot in local and regional food systems, in particular local and regional food procurement. And that was designed to enable local school districts, local hospital, community hospitals, even local prison systems, to be able to, buy locally and invest in the local producer of whatever it might be, peaches or apples or any number of products, depends on where the folks over the Good Food Purchasing Center have really done amazing work to track that at the local school district level, and again, from those other institutions. That type of procurement reform creates a lot of possibilities for helping to enhance that competitive landscape on the ground for those smaller scale farmers and ranchers that can do more. I do think there's also more work to be done based on the seeds work of looking at how intellectual property, patents, etc., connect to opportunities in specialty crops as well. But I think that's perhaps a longer term set of thinking to be done.
Yeah, great. Well, Andy, thank you so much. We've reached our time here, and really appreciate you taking the time as things wrap up for the Biden-Harris administration. Thank you so much for joining us today. For our participants, I'm sorry we haven't been able to get to all of your questions, but really appreciate your participation, your good questions today. We will make today's discussion available on our website as a recording. If you're interested in the Berkeley Food Institute and upcoming discussions like these, please check us out at food.berkeley.edu. Thanks again, Andy.